Hello, my name's Nick Sawyer, Head of Communications and Strategy at ISDA, and welcome to the first in a trio of videos looking at the implementation of margin rules for non-cleared derivatives. The series will provide an overview of the margin rules with a particular focus on the challenges posed by the variation margin Big Bang on March the 1st, 2017. I'm joined by Scott O'Malia, ISDA's CEO. So Scott, let's start off with a high-level look at the rules. What do they entail and why have they been introduced?
Well, the G20 objective laid out very specific rules for the collection of collateral and the exchange of collateral for counterparties. Those rules have come into effect beginning September 1. They require the posting of variation margin and for the largest participants, initial margin. Now, variation margin deals with the daily mark-to-mark and change in price. And this will require firms to exchange margin on a daily basis, and is very important. It lays out very specific rules for the what is eligible collateral and the timetable for exchanging that. That's very important. That's one element. The other is initial margin. This will affect the largest entities, and many of them have not exchanged initial margin up until now, but they will be required to set up segregated accounts and again meet the regulatory requirements. Now, ISDA has been working with its membership to address these implementation timetables, developing the documentation and initial margin methodology so all firms can comply in the timetables required.
So implementation has already begun. How much progress has been made so far?
Well, we passed the important September 1 deadline. Now, this was implementation was required in U.S., Japan, and Canada, and it affected the largest global banks. There were some hiccups. There were some challenges implementing this. It requires the establishment of a separate segregated account, a trust, and people were working right up until the wire to get these new accounts implemented. It was hundreds of accounts. Now, and it still was a challenge for the global banks to put all these relationships in place. The next deadline will be in Europe in early 2017, probably mid-January. So they'll need to have that phase 1 initial and variation margin ready to go by that deadline. And the following Big Bang March 1 deadline will soon follow, and that is significantly larger requirement for people to post variation margin.
Okay, so let's focus in on that March the 1st variation margin requirement. You mentioned earlier on that most firms already post variation margins. So what's the big deal?
Well, it is a big deal, and it's a very important deadline to meet because if people want to trade, they need to have updated regulatory compliant documentation in place. And this will affect all financial institutions, asset managers, pension funds, and banks. So they need to have and begin to renegotiate all of their documentation to make sure that they have regulatory compliant documentation. I cannot stress how important this is to begin working on that now, because the March 1 deadline will soon be upon us. We've learned from the September 1 deadline that the hundreds of entities and counterparties had challenges associated with the initial margin. This is going to affect thousands of counterparties with thousands of documents. So it's very important that they begin their work now in order to be ready to trade for that March 1 deadline. Following that deadline, we are going to be looking towards the September 1, 2017 deadline, when the next phase of large regional banks will have to implement their own initial margin requirements. And again, focusing on setting up those segregated accounts will be very important.
Thanks, Scott. We hope that's given you a brief overview of what the rules actually involve. In the next video, we'll look more closely at the variation margin implementation process, as well as the work required to be in compliance with the rules by March the 1st.